We have a special guest today, Lanhee Chen. He's the fellow at Hoover Institute from Stanford University. Lanhee, welcome to Bloomberg HT.
Thank you.
My first question is, what is Bidenomics and what does it mean for 2024?
Well, Bidenomics is the name that's been given to President Biden's economic policy. And predominantly, it's a combination of efforts to grow the role of the federal government in the U.S. economy. That is meant, for example, the use of U.S. government funds to subsidize certain industries and to subsidize certain priorities, for example, semiconductors. The semiconductor industry has benefited from something called the CHIPS Act. It's also meant further investment in infrastructure in the form of the infrastructure bill, as well as spending on certain social services that are part of something called the Inflation Reduction Act. So all of those policies that President Biden has embraced on the economic side are part of what's called Bidenomics, and that's something that will play a factor and a role in the 2024 presidential election. President Biden is going to be campaigning on his economic record, and that economic record he and his team are calling Bidenomics.
And since you are very active at the Republican Party, overall, what are the main differences between Republican Party's economic agenda versus Democratic Party's agenda, since there is a tension at the Congress at the same time for the economic agenda?
Well, the biggest differences on the economic agenda really fall into the role of government and how much the federal government in Washington, in particular, the role that they play in certain parts of the economy. In general, I would say President Biden and Democrats are in favor of more federal government involvement, higher taxes, more regulation. Again, greater involvement for that part of the government sector in the economy and the functioning of the economy. Republicans have generally been, and I think still in this case, are in favor of lower taxes, less federal government involvement, more tailored regulation. So it's two relatively divergent visions. Now, within the Democratic Party, there are some who want to go even farther. They would like to create a single-payer healthcare system, for example, which means the government would basically take over the healthcare system, unlike what we have in America right now, which is really a combination of private sector and government involved in healthcare. And then there are some Republicans who take a different view. There are some Republicans who would like to see the federal government more involved in the same way that Democrats do. So it's not as simple as a singular vision for Republicans and Democrats. There are actually differences, but by and large, the differences between Republicans and Democrats are as I have outlined.
And when we look at the 24 presidential candidates from the Republican Party, maybe it's too early to talk about their economic agenda. Do you see any differences between the candidates from the Republican Party?
Well, it is a little bit early. A lot of the candidates have not presented their economic policy plans yet. Former President Donald Trump is running for office again. He will likely, instead of pointing toward a set of policies he wants to pass, he'll talk about his record as president. He'll talk about the tax reduction bill that he signed into law called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017. He will talk about that. He will talk about the deregulatory efforts undertaken during his administration. So he's going to talk about his record in all likelihood and tout the accomplishments of his administration as he looks to win another term in office. The other major Republicans haven't said as much about what their economic policies will look like yet. And so we're going to be waiting to hear, are they in favor of more tax cuts? Are they in favor of more regulatory reduction? Are they in favor of some of the things maybe Biden has done? So we're going to learn a lot more about the Republican candidates and where they stand over, I would say, the next couple months.
And Federal Reserve meeting coming up. Do you think Federal Reserve's is conservative monetary policy is working? What's your expectation from the Fed meeting?
Federal Reserve has the toughest job in America right now. They've got to figure out how to continue to keep us out of recession, keep employment healthy, but also continue to control inflation. And the Federal Reserve in the United States has what we call a dual mandate. On the one hand, they're committed to full employment. On the other hand, they're also committed to stable monetary level or restricting and controlling inflation. So those two targets are sometimes in tension with one another. So they're going to have to pull off what we call a soft landing here in the US. In other words, they're going to have to continue to increase rates a little bit, which they've talked about doing potentially 2 more times this year. They're going to have to increase rates while making sure that those increases don't lead to additional inflationary pressure or put the U.S. economy into recession, which is, of course, the big concern, is that the U.S. economy is headed for some form of slowdown. So the Federal Reserve has a significant responsibility. We're going to see over the next couple of months what they decide to do, but the general consensus has been that they will continue to hike rates a few more times in a relatively stable fashion. And then once that's done, the rate increases will be done and we'll move in a different direction.
And my last question, since you are based in California and many banks had a problem nationwide, but especially Silicon Valley failure, and it was a supervision and regulation issues, how do you see the future of banking system in the States?
Well, the banking system in the United States is one of those systems that's gone through several different rounds of significant regulation. After the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, a series of requirements were put in place by a law called Dodd-Frank, which really significantly exerted additional regulatory pressure on the financial services industry. And in some ways, that was very good. In other ways, I think it's presented some challenges. And one of the challenges that came up was the fact that many regional banks were not regulated to the same degree as the very, very large banks in the United States. And so if you take Silicon Valley Bank as an example, one of the challenges that came up was there was very little oversight of what they were doing in terms of where they were putting customer assets. They were largely invested in a very long federal treasuries. So federal treasuries, for example, that had durations in, the 15, 30, 45, years and beyond. And so the challenge was because there wasn't a lot of regulation around that, as the Federal Reserve continued to raise interest rates and the short-term instruments became more popular, it left Silicon Valley Bank in a difficult cash position. And so some of this regulatory effort that probably should have been directed at regional banks as well was not. So what's happened after that are increasing calls in Congress and in the administration to increase the amount of regulation, particularly on regional banks. So I think one of the things you're going to see over the coming months and years is an increased interest in what can be done to ensure that consumers are properly protected who are banking at these regional and smaller banks.
Lanhee, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.